Well, hello there, Kansas, America, and the world. I am Jay Steinmetz. Another hour of talking politics, talking democracy, and discussing here more international relations. And I have a returning guest, Daniel. Say hello, Daniel.
Hello to all of you. My name is Daniel Science. I'm a senior majoring in political science here at Fort Hays State University, and I came on because this is part of my main interest.
Yeah, and Daniel and I have a lot of conversations about international relations, comparative politics, understanding the world, American foreign policy. I am an assistant professor here at Fort Hays State University, and I study mostly American politics and political theory. But we're here to talk mostly about U.S., China, and the Korea problem, North Korea and South Korea. Well, I think first of all, the place to begin is that in the past 20, 30, 40 years, China has gone through a major political and economic transformation. This has often been called the Third Way, or the China's Third Way, which is essentially to adopt a lot of capitalist reforms and to modernize the economy, but maintain an authoritarian political structure. China has not gone toward democracy, but it has gone toward capitalism. This is what's been often called the Third Way. I think it's important to open up with this because this has created a bit of a gap and a dissonance between China and North Korea. Long-time historical alliance there that was forged, of course, in a post-World War II environment, forged through the Korean War. There's been a gap that has increased. North Korea has not modernized its economy, has not opted for capitalism as China has. And I think that's created a bit of a gap. Do you see that as well, or do you think that there are other factors that have contributed to a bit of a gap and a chasm between the interests of China and the interests of Pyongyang and North Korea?
No, I think you were fairly spot on. What kind of saved China from the fallout following the Cultural Revolution of Mao Zedong was that Deng Xiaoping and the reformists basically said we need to bring on capitalism to help quickly modernize our infrastructure, technology, and things like that. Whereas North Korea completely just rejected all of that in favor of the Kims being completely in total power.
Yeah, and a strict planned economy, top-down planned economy, very, very indicative of a more authoritarian political structure. Do you think what is the reason why Pyongyang hasn't gone along with China in that Third Way? Perhaps opened up its economy more, modernized, or created a more capitalist structure to its economy. Are there explanations as to why Pyongyang hasn't gone in that direction with China?
It really just goes back to power lust.
Yeah.
It's just because in the case of China, really all dictatorships that kind of go that direction, like Saudi Arabia, China, there's a little bit of a give and take. So even though you have authoritarian government in charge, it can't be completely in control. There has to be some kind of, I guess, for global approval, you have to have some certain level of, I guess, decency, perceived decency. Whereas the Kim family is a lot more power hungry to a point where they don't want to have that give and take.
Yeah. Well, with the development of capitalism comes some opening of society itself. Exactly. And that really cuts against the interests of the leadership in Pyongyang, right? The North Korean...
It's founded on the idea that, Kim Il-sung was, liberating Korea by fighting capitalism. Otherwise, once you acknowledge, okay, we can actually use capitalism, that basically undermines the entire ideology of the Kims in the first place.
How would you characterize and understand the Korean political structure? How would you say that Korean governmental political structure is a communist structure?
I don't want to delve too deep into theory, but really it is kind of a typical neo-Stalinist regime. Or I would call it a fascist regime, actually. Complete and total mind control, social, the dear leader should never be criticized in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah, a classic cult of personality that's developed at the highest level of political authority.
There's this joke that's been said that it was almost as if Kim Il-sung took a Korean copy of 1984 by George Orwell and said, okay, let's see if we can make this work. It's a police state. There is no freedom of thought. There is no freedom of access to information. It's just
Yeah, and it's also a political structure and a society that is so strongly tethered to the memory of the Korean War. A lot of folks who go to North Korea make this observation that the war is alive and well in North Korea. North Korea is still very consciously at war with the United States and with the West, with South Korea. It is a wartime government still, a war that has been going on for over 60 years now in that North Korean mindset. In the American political perspective of the Korean War, that war was long over, right? That war was in the past. Yes, it's still officially a declaration of war, but United States political culture has well moved beyond. There have been several wars subsequently after the Korean War. But in a North Korean perspective, the war lives on. The war is still ever present in their imagination. And I think that shapes a lot of the worldview and a lot of the political understanding of the rest of the world from North Korean perspective. Can you say more about that, or?
Well, really, for the most part, the conflict was stagnant because the previous dictator before Kim Jong-un, I can't remember the father's name. It goes
Kim Jong-un?
Kim Jong-un. Kim Il-sung is the original. Kim Jong-il, okay.
Yeah.
Kim Jong-il, he seemed to have some kind of understanding that, you know, this war is pretty much stagnant. There's nothing really that can be done. Whereas Kim Jong-un has basically gone the opposite direction. He's like, no, because it really was over for the most part. It really is with the arrival of Kim Jong-un that the war has kind of got hot again. You know, then now you have North Korea, you know, attack, you know, basically threatening Japan, like, whereas like it wasn't like that before.
Yeah, yeah. Although I would say that the psychology, a wartime psychology, was ever present throughout the history of North Korea. There's always been this sort of psychological position and societal awareness of a kind of wartime preparedness. You see this in the popular culture of North Korea. You see this in the symbolism and the metaphors used by government to articulate its principles and perspectives. It's very much a wartime footing. It has gotten more aggressive in terms of actions and foreign policy maneuvers that Pyongyang have pursued. And let's go there. We've had this is one of the most intractable political problems in the world today. It is a problem that has perplexed Washington in particular. How to deal with North Korea. What to do with what probably the world's most prominent rogue state, right? Do you see the situation, has it changed appreciably since Trump has come to power, and in what ways?
Well, it looks like North Korea, I'm still dying to know the details of whatever negotiations went down with the current president of South Korea and Kim Jong-un, because it seemed like, you know, when he went to go talk to Kim Jong-un, you know, everyone was like, you're crazy, he can't be negotiated with. But now all of a sudden you have Kim Jong-un, you know, visiting South Korea, and then you have all these promises to, you know, denuclearize. And it seems like, for the most part, there seems to be, and Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump seem to be on fairly good terms.
Yeah.
And, you know, they've always, it seems like, at least in terms of the press,
Yeah.
you know, when they're together in the press, it seems like they're just, you almost get the impression that they're best buddies.
Do you find some similarities between Trump and Kim Jong-un? Much has been talked about that
Personality.
yeah, that there are similar personalities in a way, or that in particular, Trump seems to value strong men in the world, seems to value authoritarian figures, such as
Sisi in Egypt.
Yep,
The Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia.
Putin in Russia.
Putin in Russia. To some lesser extent, Xi Jinping in China. And Erdogan in Turkey.
Yeah, yeah. Is that just a characteristic of Trump, or is that a substantive policy change, a change in direction of American policy? Do you see American foreign policy substantively changing from this, or is this mostly just a personality thing with Donald Trump, and it's gonna evaporate as quickly as he leaves office?
No, the sad thing is this was always a thing in American foreign policy. It just wasn't as blatant in your face. The U.S. had already been supporting Abdel Fattah al-Sisi in Egypt,
Mm-hmm.
we've always been arming Saudi Arabia, even before Bin Salman, even before Gamal Khashoggi, and we're still arming them, and we'll probably still be arming them after Trump leaves office. And we've already did have diplomatic relations with Turkey and had military bases in Turkey.
Sure.
So this isn't anything new. This is just basically someone's just saying out loud what we already all knew.
Sure, I can see that. Although, to push back a little bit, I think that that there is something tangible with regards to Washington's foreign policy, American foreign policy, that it has generally favored what you might call an international order. And an international order is a broad-based sort of Western alliance around core liberal ideals, both social liberal ideals and economic liberal ideals like free trade. And yes, there are certainly exceptions. Erdogan in Turkey, certainly Egypt, America is much more supportive of a military authoritarian leadership of Egypt than, for example, a Muslim Brotherhood or more democratic Egypt. Saudi Arabia, that's an exception as well. But you see with regards to a number of other more authoritarian figures in the world, Putin, in Venezuela, Chavez, Maduro, in Bolivia, that Washington is generally not nearly as supportive of those more authoritarian leaders and more supportive of a kind of broad-based international order, of which international organizations like the United Nations hold them up. That seems to be a substantive difference from Trump. That Trump really is rejecting things like NATO, a Western European alliance, the United Nations itself, and the role that it has in sort of mitigating against more of those nationalistic and perhaps more authoritarian effects. Does that make sense?
Well, those paleoconservative thoughts have always been around in Congress, though, with like Ron Paul and Rand Paul and things like that. So there have always been those voices in Washington that they just never had the chance to get into power.
Yeah.
But in terms of how they conducted themselves, the United States completely went, never, I don't know how to say it the right way, but the Bush administration completely disregarded the United Nations every single step of the way, leading up to the Iraq War, and after. So, and of course, there's been the whole issue with the United Nations in Israel. The U.S. has obviously gone against the United Nations 100% of the time when it comes to Israel. So this sort of disregard for the rest of the world in terms of like foreign policy advice really is not, I again repeat, it's not anything new. It's just, there might be a few slight differences. For example, I don't think anybody, president has ever been openly anti-NATO. But really, there's always been a certain realist position that you kind of have to make a deal with the devil to kind of get your way. So it's always been out there. It's just nobody said it out loud.
Yeah, and that's what I was going to ask. Is this a realist foreign policy? Is this realism in foreign policy? Is that what this is? Is this what we're describing?
Kissinger on
steroids. So let's move it back to North Korea here. What does the United States do with regards to North Korea? We've seen some movement. We've seen some rapprochement between the North and the South. Whether or not Trump has had an effect here, we left off with that there might be some personality characteristics that are similar between Trump and Kim Jong-un. I've always thought that Trump is just the right kind of crazy to be able to solve the North Korean problem, because it seems to be a kind of crazy, schizophrenic political problem itself. And it seems as though there is some movement here. Where are we going, and what do we hope to achieve? What ultimately is the end game? Do you think that we're in the end stages of this Korea problem?
It's just, I typically focus on the Middle East, but North Korea is an anomaly because it's like you said, it's very schizophrenic, and one moment Kim Jong-un is threatening to nuke us. He attacks Japan, and he thinks, this is going to be the spark. This is going to be the thing that reignites the Korean War and possibly starts in World War III. But I guess a few fawning words from Trump and some kind of rapprochement from the South Korean president, and now he's all on board, and now he's meeting with Trump in Singapore.
It really is all over the place, and that has been long characteristic of North Korea. That North Korea has burned both ends of the candle, so to speak. Often really apocalyptic rhetoric, very, very direct threats on America, and then within months they're talking about rapprochement, or famously Madeleine Albright visiting North Korea the late 1990s, which ultimately didn't lead to anything. So it's always a matter of Washington foreign policy trying to judge or trying to read the tea leaves and figure out what is the real North Korean position, because there seem to be a lot of conflicting things that come out of Pyongyang. It's hard to read.
Well, I think this goes back to Kim Jong-un as a person. I think he is very. I just don't. I'm of the opinion that he's not well mentally. I just think this is a person who can change his mind any 65 times a week. And there really is, and of course the military really is. No one's ever going to stand up to him. That's just how it works. It's not like you're never going to see a coup in North Korea. I promise you that. So I think it really is just a matter of, I guess Trump might have I mean, he could possibly have it down and just sing fawning praise, and maybe he'll just do what you said.
Yeah.
Maybe he's really that much of a narcissist that he just wants to be praised all the time by the words.
Yeah.
Power.
Could be, yeah. And I think that another factor here with North Korea, you said, that the leader is perhaps not mentally well. I wonder, I struggle for how anyone in a North Korean society, how closed and repressive that society is. I struggle to understand how anyone might remain sane, especially over several generations of that kind of political oppression and that kind of closed, controlled society. It seems to have a profound effect on the psychology of North Koreans. We've seen this from defectors. When defectors defect from North Korea, they often talk about, within the language of like post-traumatic syndrome, the experience of living in such a repressive society. And I think that might go to explain, I agree with you, that it's very unlikely that there would ever be a real coup or ever a uprising or a revolution in North Korean society, because that society has been effectively brainwashed. There is such a high level of psychological control that corresponds with that kind of political oppression. Would you agree with that, or?
No, I think it's 100% accurate. It's like I said, it's
Yeah.
probably the most brutal dictatorship the world has ever seen.
Yeah, and the level of control is, of course, often talked about. The degree to which an average North Korean, every aspect of society, every aspect of their behavior there is a sort of top-down control from the highest levels of political authority. There is a huge dichotomy between the North and the South. South Korea is, I think, the 9th or 10th largest economy in the world, right? An economy that's actually larger than Russia. You have a global, multinational, a global reach to its economic power, South Korean economic power. You also have a major cultural power in South Korea. Movies, pop culture, music. I mean, South Korea is a leader in the kind of cultural expressions that we see around the world. Things couldn't be further from the case in North Korea. There is a massive dichotomy right across the border. If the Koreas could ever unify, which from my understanding is the goal of a majority of South Koreans, and certainly the express goal of Pyongyang, that if the Koreas agree about anything, it's that they hope for a future in which Korea can be unified again.
I don't think that's feasible.
Yeah, and that's really the question.
I think that's completely not going to happen.
Yeah.
It would take just trillions of dollars to try and reintegrate, not centuries, but decades worth of North Koreans being brainwashed into this mindset that they have. Many of them are malnourished. The average North Korean soldier is about, I think, 4 inches shorter than the South Korean soldier. That it would take decades to reintegrate them back into one country. It's just never going to happen.
We have a model of this in the world, and that model is West Germany and East Germany, which were unified in 1989.
But this is different. This was nowhere near as long as North Korea now.
Not that far away. I mean, you talk about the division of West Germany and East Germany in the 1940s, the division of Korea in the 1950s. I mean, yes, okay, it is longer now. It's about 20 years longer.
But the brainwashing in East Germany and living conditions weren't as horrifyingly bad as North Korea's.
I think that's the big difference, isn't it?
That's a massive difference.
The East German society was very repressive. The intelligence services under the Stasi, notorious, right? One of the most repressive intelligence services behind the Iron Curtain. There was a degree of political oppression that was obviously very apparent, but there was nonetheless, within East Germany, there was a degree of openness that you just don't see in North Korea. And I think that makes a big difference. I really do. And we saw over time, now this is another question I was going to ask with regards to North Korea. Do you see that regime weakening over time?
Yes, I'm of the firm opinion that fascist regimes never survive.
Yeah.
Fascist regimes inherently breed instability,
Mm.
and they almost always breed power struggles that lead to the downfall. I mean, back you can use South Korea as an example.
Yeah.
South Korea, until the 1990s, was really indistinguishable from North Korea in terms of how it was ruled and governed.
In terms of authoritarianism, yeah, they were both authoritarian.
I mean,
yeah.
Park Chung-hee, the president who kind of ignited some of their economic reforms, was notorious for kidnapping, torturing, and murdering homeless people,
Yeah.
or putting them in, pretty much concentration camps.
Mhm.
And it was basically president after president would get killed in an assassination, a coup, and then there would be another repressive dictator. And these repressive dictators would have a sort of iron fist control of, like, the North Korean caliber of media.
Yeah.
In fact, up to the 1990s, there was no actual pop culture
Yeah,
because the
yeah.
government had so much control over
Yeah,
everybody.
yeah. But I see a puzzle here. I see the example of South Korea, and I hear you, that fascist regimes inherently weaken over time. But a bit of a puzzle here is that we both agreed that a overthrow of the Pyongyang regime is highly unlikely. You're insinuating that the North Korean regime has weakened over time, but in what way? One might make the argument that it's actually strengthened over time. It seems to be increasingly unlikely that there's ever going to be an uprising or some kind of internal overthrow of this North Korean dictatorship. So how can we make sense of that puzzle? If fascist regimes, as you say, inherently weaken over time and breed instability, what does that look like in the North Korean example? Are we actually seeing that in the North Korean example?
Really, this is pretty much an obvious fact to anybody, but really China's the only thing keeping that regime alive.
Mm.
It really is.
Mhm.
I mean, that regime that's because in previous regimes like apartheid South Africa, it was basically what the spark that lit the fire was basically that the U.S. realized that we can't do this anymore.
Uh-huh.
There was massive protest in the U.S. against apartheid South Africa. And
Yeah.
we just can't we can't afford to do this anymore.
Yeah, yeah.
And the same kind of happened with Rhodesia and various other dictatorships like with Chile and things like that.
Uh-huh.
Things like that, where the U.S. had to kind of make the call that we can't, for PR reasons, we just can't afford to do this.
Mhm.
I'm the cynical opinion that they don't care about what's right. It's really just PR.
Yeah.
Whereas China does not really seem to care what the world thinks about it very much. I mean, in terms of investment, obviously business, economy-wise, but China seems to be very self-aware of the fact that they have a lot of, they have a lot of political capital.
Mhm.
Really, you can't really coerce China into doing anything.
Mhm.
That kind of also ties into the UN. Whereas the UN's pretty much useless because the US, China, and Russia basically dominate the show.
Okay, so there's two kind of directions that I want to go here. One, let me just get kind of my own viewpoint about this is I'm a little skeptical of the claim that fascist regimes will inherently weaken over time. Mm-hmm. I think part of the factor there that is the case is that the degree of openness to a political regime inherently weakens authoritarian structures. That as a society in any way is open to the rest of the world in seeing ways of life that are different, authoritarianisms and repressive political structures tend to weaken over time. And I think we saw this in Eastern Europe in the Cold War, that the Iron Curtain was not there was a bit porous. And where it was porous, it tended to weaken the authoritarian regimes themselves. The more that the East became aware of democracy in the West, the more likely it was that there was a weakening of the repressive totalitarian regime itself. I think that the reason why North Korea has not really weakened over time is because it is so incredibly closed. And the insulated nature of its political community has actually created some durability and stability. So in other words, I think it's maybe a little less the relationship with China and a little more to do with the very literal fortress that North Korea has built up against the world that has kept that regime in power for a remarkably long time. If there were any degree of openness akin to maybe East Germany, we would have seen the North Korean regime weaken a lot more than it otherwise had. But let me go in a different direction and ask you a really important question. What does China get out of its relationship to North Korea?
Well, China does not want to, well, kind of with South Korea, China does not want an entire peninsula underneath it being on good terms with the U.S. I mean, from a geopolitical standpoint, you don't. It's already bad enough that they have to deal with South Korea down there, which is why they intervened in the Korean War in the first place. They did not, because when the U.S. drove them all back in the Korean War, China had United States troops on its border, and that's why they had to intervene and make North Korea. So if you're China, you do not want an entire peninsula that's on good terms with the U.S. That's just geopolitically not in your favor.
So it's a weird advantage. It's a weird thing that China gets out of its relationship with North Korea, which is in some ways kind of a lesser of two evils. For the most part, Pyongyang is basically a problem for China. The only thing that makes it not a problem is that North Korea is not South Korea, and that North Korea is not pro-America. And that's the only benefit that China gets out of it. Its benefit is really a negation in some ways. Do you see that relationship has weakened over time? Now, China has grown closer to the United States over time, economically.
Economically, but not diplomatically or politically.
Yeah.
And I think that's important.
Do you think that the diplomacy and the politics will follow along with the economic relationship, that the tighter links there are between the United States and China economically, that it will essentially grease the wheels for better diplomatic terms over time? This has often been said by liberals. This is core liberal ideology. I mean, Adam Smith wrote about this in The Wealth of Nations, that the more free trade and that the more economic relations exist between countries, the more likely they are toward peace.
No, I tend to take the more pessimistic view that in terms of these large nation states like the United States and China and Russia, competition's inherent. No one ever thinks, no one goes and ask any economist really, or any person who specializes in diplomacy, and they'll tell you the same thing. No one ever goes in there thinking that, oh, we're going to get a deal that benefits everyone, equally. No, almost always people want to take the spoils home.
And you see it more as a zero-sum game. This is very much a realist approach to international relations as well.
But I don't think it's right. I just think that's just more like the Marxist realist idea that countries nation states are inherently greedy.
Yeah, and competitive with one another. And one country's gain is another country's loss.
Yeah.
A zero-sum game.
That's right.
Yeah.
But I'm saying that that's just the way things are.
Yeah.
The U.S. and China are not interested in being on equal terms. One, obviously, they both want global hegemony.
Yeah. To a certain extent, yes, indeed. We see, though, that their economies are so tied together now that they cannot, in any real appreciable way, support the decline of their adversary's economy, because it will mean the decline of their own economy, right? If China seeks to undermine American economic power, it might very well undermine its own economic power in doing so, because these economies are so well tied together, right? Does that make sense? I think there's a real puzzle there, and it's really interesting to see to what extent or effect, and I think you're right. I think that the binding of the economic relationship between China and America has not resulted in substantially better diplomatic terms. And this is one of the reasons why the alliance with China and North Korea has held, even though China has moved in the direction of capitalism and North Korea remains a very insulated, enclosed society. Our time is up for today. We've got so much to do. I mean, we just really just began. But it was very fun talking to you, as always, Daniel. And I appreciate you all you listeners out there tuning in. And until next time, we're going to be done for the Christmas break. We'll be back at the end of January with more talk and politics here. So we'll see you then, and happy holidays to everybody. Take care.